Hi everybody, Sharyl Attkisson here. Welcome to a special edition of Full Measure After Hours. Today, Cuba on the cusp, a direct message to Donald Trump. Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister Carlos Fernández de Cossío addresses current tensions and communications between the U.S. and Cuba. In 2023, I visited Cuba for my television program Full Measure. The island nation was economically stressed and trying to shed some of its Soviet-style economic traits in favor of embracing more open market-type features. Fascinating. But things have grown only worse since then for the economy, particularly with the U.S. invasion of Venezuela. Cuba was already having trouble buying oil to power its nation due to the long-standing U.S. embargo against Cuba. But with the Venezuela supply now gone, the economic status has turned dire. As you're about to hear, there are power blackouts of up to 18 hours a day in some cases, according to Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernández de Cossío. He says the U.S. has indeed requested an open line of communications with Cuba. That's new. Cuba has accepted. The U.S. has also indicted the brother of former leader Fidel Castro. Is military conflict imminent? There's lots of news here in this interview, so here's Carlos Fernández de Cossío. Can you give a brief overview as to the latest that you know is happening between the U.S. and Cuba in terms of any discussions or talks, and at what levels?
We have a channel of communication by proposal of the United States that we accepted. We have a tradition of being ready to use dialogue as a way to solve problems with the United States and even with any country. We truly believe that the alternative to dialogue is always conflict, and we prefer it not to be there. But today, even though this dialogue is still open and we are ready to use it, we see a contradiction between the actions that week after week the U.S. is taking against Cuba, hostile actions, and the seriousness and the level of responsibility that one would expect, one would need for a dialogue like this one to go forward. So we don't see much progress, but again, we're ready to find it if the U.S. has the willingness to seriously and responsibly try to find an accommodation between the two countries.
Can you tell us when they sought to open the channel of communication and who reached out on behalf of whom? Who's doing any open channels?
I prefer not to go into details because both the U.S. and the Cuban government will be having quite discreet in what we're doing, and I will let the U.S. government to speak for itself. From our side is the government of Cuba in general, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and high-level officials of the government.
I understand there is conflict, in terms of what's going on between the U.S. and Cuba. But when I visited there, you were eager to have some kind of communications or discussions with the United States. Is there anything potentially positive that you see out of the channel being opened?
I believe that the current president of the United States, in our opinion, has the political strength and even the courage, I would say, to try to find a solution for a problem that is very old, that is older than we are, and that the current generations of Cubans and the current generations of Americans mostly don't even understand how it began. And it's a problem between two sovereign states. And it requires for U.S. politicians to understand that Cuba is and has the right to be a sovereign state, and that we pretend to defend that right as the U.S. has defended its right to be a sovereign state. I believe you'll be celebrating that a few weeks from now, the 250th anniversary. And Cuba wants to have the same footing as a sovereign state.
What message would you like to send to President Trump? He watches our television program. Is there something, if he could see you directly, that you would like to just send in terms of overall comment or thoughts?
Cuba is not an enemy of the United States. We don't want to be an enemy of the United States. In fact, we'd like to have a constructive and, if possible, friendly relationship with the United States. We would like no interference from a foreign government in our domestic affairs, nor therefore to be government interference in the relationship between US citizens and Cuban citizens for us to relate with each other. We're not asking for the US to finance Cuba. We're not even asking for aid, for American taxpayers to have to invest and to finance Cuba. What we're asking is to be left alone. If we're going to fail or if we're going to succeed, to do it on our own. And in that way, to have a respectful and relationship and responsible relationship with the United States. That is our wish.
You say you don't want financial assistance, but I'm pretty sure you would like to have a trade relationship. Is that not true?
That is very true. We'd like for U.S. business and citizens of the United States to be able to engage with Cuba freely, and with Cuba to be able to engage freely in business with the United States. And for the U.S. not to interfere in Cuba's business relationships with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, that is not the situation that we have today. You might know that based on legislation and on policies that are standing in the U.S. today, all that is suffering obstacles. And there's a lot of limitations for Cuba's economy to perform and to develop and to be managed because of the coercive restrictions put in place by the United States. So we do welcome a trade relationship with the United States and a trade relationship with the rest of the world on an equal footing.
Do you see the United States position that we believe as a policy, we have a national security interest because Cuba is so close to the United States that the United States is concerned if it thinks China is, for example, building spy bases on Cuba property and things like that? Do you understand the U.S. saying that it has an interest in perhaps who you do, what kind of business you do with other countries?
We do understand, but the United States has economically a greater business relationship with China than we do, to give you an example. But we would understand that the U.S. be concerned if Cuba would have a spy station from another government, including China or whatever other country. But that is not the case. And the U.S. security agencies know that that is not the case. That the only foreign military base in Cuba is in Guantanamo, and it's a U.S. military base. The U.S. knows that. I know that there are a lot of excuses being used to try to justify a hostile and aggressive policy towards Cuba, including trying to justify military action against Cuba that would cause death, that would cause destruction, that would cause a humanitarian crisis, and very possibly a bloodshed that would involve both Cubans and Americans. There are people pushing for that agenda, and they build excuses like threats from Cuba to the United States, which are not there, they're not real, and they have not been proven by those who are claiming that they exist.
Are you concerned that there is some type of military action by the United States against Cuba in the works or potential in the coming weeks or months?
We are concerned because we follow what is being stated by several politicians in the US, and every now and then, even the government of the United States. And we also follow that few are asking the question, which would be the excuse? What could justify promoting bloodshed, promoting destruction so close to the United States or anywhere, promoting death? What would justify? I'm sure most Americans would not agree with that if given the facts. I'm not sure that they're not in the interest of the majority of US citizens. They are perhaps the interest of a small cabal of elite, wealthy and perhaps powerful and influential people, but they're not the interest of the US citizen, and certainly they're not in the interest of Cuban citizens.
Without divulging sensitive information, can you tell me that when the United States suggested opening communications, did anybody have an initial list of demands? In other words, did the U.S. ask for something? Did Cuba ask for something? Or did it not go to that level yet?
Our asking are evident to put an end to the fuel blockade that exists today, that does not allow Cuba to import fuel from any country in the world, imposed by the U.S. in January, to put an end to the very severe economic coercive measures that make life practically unbearable for the people of Cuba. Those are our asks. And for that, we are ready to engage in cooperation with the U.S. In the U.S., sometimes there are expectations that are very unrealistic, like pretending for Cuba to negotiate its domestic affairs, its political system, its constitutional system. Of course, Cuba is not ready for that. Countries don't do that. There's no example of a country negotiating with another one, how it organizes itself domestically. And it should not be expected from Cuba either.
On May 20th, the Justice Department in the United States charged former Cuban President Raul Castro, who was defense minister at the time, and 5 other Cuban officials or military figures in the February 1996 shoot-down of unarmed civilian planes operated by the Miami-based exile group Brothers to the Rescue. What is your comment on that?
The initial comment is that it's an opportunistic political move that has no legal or moral grounds. It responds, again, to a cabal of wealthy elite, mostly concentrated in southern Florida. If one looks at the historical record, and it's public record, the U.S. government is the main responsible for what occurred that day and the deaths that occurred that day. The planes of Brothers to the Rescue, which is a terrorist organization that perhaps continues to exist in the U.S., I don't know if it exists today, but it did then, violated Cuban airspace deliberately and constantly between 1994 and 1996. In spite of 25 communications from Cuba to the U.S. government, including communications directly to the president of the time, alerting on the consequences of this happening because Cuba could not continue to allow it. These were defiant violations of Cuba airspace. It has been made public. Some communications have been made public, released afterwards, that there were communications between the State Department, the National Security Council, and even the Aviation Authority in the United States about the dangers of what was occurring. And that inevitably Cuba would have to respond. And this would be provoking a catastrophic result. This is language used by U.S. authorities in their communications. So the U.S. government knew that this was happening. The U.S. government had it in its power to stop these people from violating Cuban airspace and decided not to act. One would ask, what would be the result, or what would be the outcome, or which is the outcome that has already occurred when hostile vessels, aircraft of other countries have entered U.S. airspace? What has been the result, and which would be the response that is expected from the U.S. government in protecting U.S. airspace and peace and tranquility for its people? So Cuba acted, first of all, in protecting its airspace and peace, and alerted repeatedly the United States that this could not be allowed. And the U.S. government simply turned its eye or its sight and allowed this to occur, knowing that it would end in a catastrophic result. The reason why the U.S. had acted in this way is something that would have to be asked to the government of the time.
Raul Castro, is he like 96 years old or coming up on 95, 96 years old?
He'll be soon 95.
Okay. And he is, just for people's reference, correct me where I'm wrong, Fidel Castro's younger brother, and held a position in government for some time when this was going on, this issue we're talking about. Does he currently hold any government position?
He was Minister of Armed Forces at the time. Currently, he has no position. But he has a very influential presence in Cuba. He's admired. He's a person with a large historical authority in the country for the majority of the population. So he's a personality respected, like many could be in the United States and other countries, but he holds no official position at this moment.
Did the U.S. make a formal request for Cuba to turn him over or extradite him? I don't know if that's the right word since he's a Cuban national, but has the U.S. requested anything?
There has been no specific communication by the U.S. regarding the issue, at least to the government of Cuba.
I'd like to spend a little time discussing the current economic status of Cuba and then a little bit of the history, which I think people will find interesting between the United States and Cuba. But first of all, what is the economic status? The thing we hear in the United States is things are very, very bad. And I know you've worked hard to try to transform your economy to some degree from the Soviet style economy to something that has a bit more market orientation. Can you describe the state of the economy and what you're doing about it today?
The situation, I would say, is a dire situation, a very difficult economic situation. The U.S. has been capable in the current year to reinforce the coercive measures that it already had in place. And it has provoked a practical, or is seeking a disconnection of Cuba from the world economy. Cuba is incapable of receiving fuel, and the country needs fuel to perform like any country in the world. It has very extreme difficulties to have access to technology, to have access to markets, to have access to financing. So one can ask, what country can perform peacefully or naturally under those conditions? The US, it seems to be seeking an induced humanitarian crisis in Cuba, which will have an immense cost for Cuba. It would not achieve the US any political goals that one can identify could be of interest to the majority of US citizens, or that could be of interest for the national security of the United States. But it is the road that the US seems to have set for Cuba to, in the short or the medium term, to reach a point of humanitarian crisis, again, for the benefit of no one. And that is the situation we have today. In parallel to that, as I have explained in previous conversations that we have had, Cuba is undergoing a process of transformation that has been very difficult and slower than we had planned. To some extent, by our own doing, by our own limitations, but to a very great extent because of the extreme limitations that are put in place by the US economic coercions, which again limits Cuba's financing, limits Cuba's access to technology, to markets. So it's very difficult for any country to undergo a significant transformation that changes decades of a specific pattern when you have those huge limitations. If they were to be eased, we could move forward, we could advance these transformations, we could have much better opportunity for our economic development, and it would give also opportunities for US business to be dealing with Cuba if US laws and regulations would not prohibit it as they do today.
You pointed out that the US does a lot of business with China, true. The US doesn't like, the fact that Cuba is doing some business with our adversaries or US adversaries. But is it true that because of the US embargo, much of the Western world, including European countries and so on, will not do business with Cuba? Are you left with nobody else other than our adversaries who will do business with you?
The US has proclaimed that they would apply economic coercive measures, including tariffs, to any country that exports fuel to Cuba. That is a huge demand, and it sends a threat to almost every country. They are now threatening companies that do business, European companies, Canadian companies that do business in Cuba, countries from the Western Hemisphere in general, that invest in Cuba, that export to Cuba, that import from Cuba. So this threat is having an unquestionable impact on the Cuban economy. We are ready to engage with any country that is ready to do business with Cuba. What option do we have? If we could engage with the US, we would welcome it. If we could import from the United States, we would welcome it. But it's US laws, US regulations, and US policy that make that practically impossible today. Why would we need to import goods from the other side of the world or try to export to the other side of the world if we have the largest market just across from us, which would be the natural market for Cuba? And we hope that someday we could have possibility to engage commercially with the United States. Meantime, we have to recur to whoever is ready and available.
How did the United States invasion of Venezuela and the change in leadership there impact Cuba?
Basically, by prohibiting oil from being exported from Venezuela to Cuba. There's a legend going around, repeated by the US government, that Venezuela was giving oil for free to Cuba. It is not right. It was a commercial relationship that the US doesn't like or doesn't understand, but it was a commercial relationship. Today, the US government prohibits Venezuelan oil to be exported to Cuba. But in fact, today, it prohibits oil from any country to be exported to Cuba.
If I could go around in the streets of Cuba today, are there people that are starving? Are there homes that are not, cooled? What is the status of power and the economy for the average citizen there?
We have not reached the point of having people starving, even though arranging your everyday meals has become difficult, has become expensive. But the main health problem in Cuba continues to be obesity, not lack of nutrition. Now, but it is a danger and is a threat that we have before us. Now, the main problem for everyday life is today electricity, because you have blackouts or lack of electricity for many hours a day, sometimes 16, sometimes 18. Sometimes you've got over 24 hours without electricity. Now, that has an impact in cooling your home, in cooling your food, in electricity, in education, in comfort, in general for anyone, in cooking your food. But it also has an impact because it's a result of lack of fuel in public transportation, in going to work, in taking your children to school, in going to visit a relative or going to solve your everyday problems. It has an impact in cooling and energy that you need in hospitals, that you need in schools, in transportation for goods, for the consumption of the population and for normal trade in the country. So the impact is very severe, and it punishes each and every Cuban on a daily basis, each and every Cuban on a daily basis. And I'm talking here about children, elderly, women, pregnant women, men, older men, the whole population of Cuba, regardless of how they think, regardless of what they believe, but it's a general population. And that is the policy, the standing policy of the US toward Cuba, that again, I have to be convinced that majority of Americans are not aware, because they would not agree with punishing the whole population, the whole nation, just to achieve political goals.
What is the population of Cuba?
10 million, 9 million, depends on how many Cubans are travel and remain a long time outside of Cuba. But on a daily basis, on a common day like today, you could say that it's between 9 and 10 million people.
So to the history, please correct me where I'm wrong, but in 1959, there was the revolution that installed Fidel Castro. And the United States initially, I think, recognized the Castro government, but then soon after, tensions happened. Can you pick it up from there and tell us how the relationship deteriorated?
That was in 59. In April of 61, the U.S. organized an invasion of Cuba. That failed. The Bay of Pigs it's part of Cuban history. It's also part of the U.S. history. Then we had the missile crisis. And then in 62, the U.S. government established called a comprehensive embargo on Cuba. We have suffered terrorism, attempts of assassination of our leaders, bacteriological and biological warfare, plus the aim of destroying the Cuban economy since then. The U.S. cannot identify one aggressive action from Cuba to the United States. And yet Cuba has been suffering aggression from the United States, including some major terrorist acts, until 9/11, 2001, the biggest terrorist action in the Western Hemisphere was committed by people of Cuban origin living in the United States that have been former CIA agents against an aircraft in midair that killed 72 people. That was our history since then.
Was the initial?
We tried to progress in our relationship between 2014 and beginning of 2017, but then we started going back again. And we in Cuba have the firm belief that we could build a relationship. We could continue to have differences, but try to solve them in a more civilized manner than what's happening today.
In your view, was the initial tension back in the 60s over Fidel Castro's Soviet ties, or were Fidel Castro's Soviet ties a result of the tension between Cuba and the U.S.?
Well, Cuba didn't formalize relationship with the Soviet Union until 1960. And if one looks at history, the ties began to grow when the U.S. first refused to sell oil to Cuba. And the country that was ready to sell it was the United States, was the former Soviet Union. The U.S. refused to buy Cuba's only export of the time, which was sugar. And the Soviet Union was ready to buy Cuban sugar and pay us for it. The U.S. The Soviet Union was ready to provide technology to help make our industry work and provide aid to Cuba, while the U.S. was organizing invasion, attacking Cuba, and severing a very long relationship between the two countries. We would have hoped that we could build the independence of Cuba, which is what we were seeking, the political and the economic independence of Cuba, with a civilized relationship with the United States. It was made impossible at the time.
Does Cuba still have a lot of sugar, make a lot of sugar and export it to places that will take it?
No, we don't. The industry is quite depressed. We produce more or less what we need to consume. We export small amounts, and we even import some amounts at this moment.
What is the main value crops that you have, or the things that you have that you would like to engage in trade about?
We could export tobacco and cigars. We could export pharmaceuticals. It's an industry that was pre-existing before the revolution and has grown in Cuba with a lot of advance in biotechnology and genetic engineering. We have professionals. We have the capacity, and we have proven the capacity to build human resources. And we have tourism. Plus, we also have some critical minerals that are of interest. To give you some examples, I believe that we could engage with the United States. But above all, I believe Cuba today, because of the major problems that we have, is ripe for investment. And you could invest in practically anything in Cuba today. And Cuba's laws have been modernized in recent years, and we're trying to attract foreign investment as much as possible. We could hope we could have U.S. investment someday.
One red line in the sand, so to speak, for the U.S. and Cuba relations seemed to be, obviously, when Fidel Castro was in power there. He's been long gone. Can you tell me about the current president and a little bit about his background?
He is from a generation born after the Cuban Revolution. He was a university professor, was also into politics and moved in the ranks of the youth, and then the party, was head of two of our provinces, was minister for some period. So his career has been in politics in Cuba. He is an engineer by profession, and he's the current president of Cuba. He's in his second term, which ends in 2028.
So my last question, and then if you have anything to add, I'd be happy to hear it. It seems as though the current U.S. arguments against Cuba center on national security concerns, which we talked about, human rights allegations, democracy questions, and then some of these past actions, again, that we've addressed. What are your comments on the idea that Cuba is a dictatorship that the United States doesn't agree with, that it is not respecting human rights and those types of arguments?
I would first have to say that the main problem is something that happens with Cuba, but doesn't happen in the relationship of the US with other countries, which is a failure to understand that Cuba is, and as I said at the beginning, has the right to be a sovereign nation. That is at the core of the conflict between our two countries. Now, the US has disagreements with Cuban political systems, as we have disagreements with the US political system, political reality, including on democracy and including on human rights. And we don't argue and we don't complain for the US to have disagreements with Cuba, but they have to be dealt with as governments and countries do with each other. And as the US does with other countries and other governments that have political systems that are very alien and very different from the one that the US has, and yet pose no quarrels, pose no problem for the US to engage politically, economically, commercially, and culturally. So what we don't understand, unless it's a failure for the US to accept that Cuba is sovereign, why would that be an obstacle for a better relationship between Cuba and the United States?
And what has the Iran conflict done in terms of your relationship, Cuba's relationship with Iran?
There's no, I can't identify it, perhaps I have to think a lot of the impact that it has between Cuba, the relationship between Cuba and Iran. We follow it. We see it as a very serious conflict. We hope that it finds an end soon, as I think the majority of the world, including Americans, would hope that it finds an end to that conflict soon. But there's no direct link to the relationship between Cuba and Iran.
Is Cuba a dictatorship? How are elections handled there?
Cuba is not a dictatorship. Elections occur every 5 years based on what's established in our constitution. I don't think you have the time for me to explain it. And people are elected at different levels of government. Money doesn't participate, has no participation or any impact, nor financing in elections, as political parties have no impact. It's an electoral election in which people participate directly. It's not through a political party. That's why normally people say that Cuba has only one party that is elected. It's a misrepresentation of reality. The Cuban Communist Party is not an electoral party. It plays another role in society.
And how would you describe Cuba? Is it a communist country or a socialist country with a communist political system?
It's a socialist country and a nationalist country and a socialist political system.
With the Communist Party being the only political party?
Yes.
And is there anything else you would like to add?
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast and that you will consider subscribing, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a great review. As always, check out my television program on Sundays, Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson. For a list of stations and times, go to SharylAttkisson.com and click the Full Measure tab. Do your own research, make up your own mind. Think for yourself.